Andrzej Latoszewski and Agnieszka Kalinowska. These sentencing remarks are being translated. I will speak slowly to assist the interpreter. Copies of these sentencing remarks will, however, be made available to you and the press. Sebastian Kalinowski died on the 13th of August 2021. He was 15 years old. In the weeks before his death, Sebastian had been subjected to horrific physical abuse. At the post-mortem examination, he was found to have sustained 23 rib fractures. There was a large blood clot in his liver. His heart muscle was damaged. There was evidence of a muscle shearing injury to his left thigh. There was a very large number of linear scabs across his lower back and buttocks, the result of wounds to that area which had been cut sepsis and collapse. The uncontroverted medical evidence was that in the few days before his death, the infection would have caused Sebastian to have been very unwell, short of breath, very weak, and obviously so. The jury did not need to speculate as to who caused those injuries or how they were inflicted. In late June of 2021, a closed-circuit TV system was set up in the house in Leeds Road, Huddersfield, where you both lived with Sebastian. You placed cameras in the living room and in Sebastian's bedroom. After his death, the hard drive was found by the police where you had hidden it in the table in the living room. Whether or not that footage demonstrates the full extent, however, of the abuse that was meted out to Sebastian, I do not know. But it shows you, Latoszewski, using your martial arts techniques to punch and kick and knee Sebastian repeatedly about the torso and head. Using Sebastian's body in the same way as you used the punch bag which hung in your garden. The footage shows you beating Sebastian with a bed slat and an electric cable over his lower back. Sometimes you watched Latoszewski as he set about Sebastian. On other occasions you sat indifferently on the sofa, eating or drinking and watching television. On many occasions you were an active participant in the abuse. You landed blows on Sebastian too. You encouraged Latoszewski by either initiating or joining in the abuse by slapping and punching Sebastian. On the 16th of June of this year, so during the course of this trial, you both pleaded guilty to the offence of cruelty to a child. On the 14th of July 2022, again during the course of the trial, Latoszewski, you pleaded guilty to manslaughter. On the 22nd of July, the jury convicted you both of Sebastian's murder. As for the plea to manslaughter, this has been superseded by the conviction for murder. I direct that it should lie on the file and I make no order in respect of that offence. All counsel in the case agree that the offence of murder and that of cruelty cannot in this case be differentiated. The cause of Sebastian's death was infection in his ribs. Any or all of the rib fractures were involved in the process which ultimately led to his death. I will impose a sentence in respect of that offence which runs concurrently at the same time as the sentence for the offence of murder and will reflect the totality of your offending in the sentence which I impose for the offence of murder. For the offence of murder, the sentence is fixed by law. It is life imprisonment. I must decide whether the murder of Sebastian is a murder of such exceptional seriousness that it requires me to make a whole life order in accordance with paragraph 2 of Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020, or alternatively whether I should make a minimum term order. If the latter, there is no dispute but that the starting point for that minimum term order is 30 years before adjustment for aggravating and mitigating factors. If I do impose a minimum term order, then it does not follow that either of you will be released from prison at the conclusion of that minimum term. You may never be released. Whether you are will be a question for the parole board in due course. In reaching my decision on this issue, I take into account the following facts of which I am sure, having been the trial judge in this case. Sebastian was born in 2006. For the first 4 years of his life, he lived in Poland with you, Kalinowska, his mother. In 2010, you came to England to live, where you quickly began a relationship with Latoszewski. You left Sebastian in the care of his biological father, and during the 10 years which followed, you saw him on 3 occasions. Shortly before October 2020, Sebastian's father contacted you to tell you that Sebastian was getting into trouble with the authorities in Poland. You and Latoszewski went to Poland to collect him. I accept that when he first came to England to live with you both, your intention was to care for him properly. He was enrolled at school, where his teachers spoke highly of his intelligence and his courtesy, and he was always impeccably turned out. Any kindness, however, which you initially showed Sebastian was short-lived. By as early as Christmas 2020, there were signs that all was not going well. At a party, you discussed with friends your approach to punishing Sebastian for what were obviously only petty, childish misdemeanours. On the 18th of January of 2021, you, Latoszewski, recorded footage of you shouting and cursing at Sebastian. You referred to him lasting around 1 hour, recorded on that same phone later in January. We hear the sounds of you, Latoszewski, hitting Sebastian. Although the abuse takes place off camera, I have no doubt that what is recorded on that phone is the sound of you beating the soles of Sebastian's feet with a broken spindle from the staircase. We hear Sebastian's shrieks in pain. We hear your torrent of vile insults as you accuse Sebastian of lying. Kalinowska, you then covered up what had happened by lying to the school over the following few days, explaining that Sebastian couldn't come to school because he had a fever. No doubt you were both worried that the presence of bruising on Sebastian's body or his injuries would have raised alarm at school. I have no doubt that the abuse continued between January 2021 and the timing of the installation of the CCTV in June, but how severe and how often I cannot know for sure. There is, however, an audio recording available of you, Kalinowska, speaking to Latoszewski during this period in which that the abuse appears to become more frequent and far more serious. Over the course of the 3 weeks between school breaking up on the 23rd of July and Sebastian's death on the 13th of August, there is scarcely a day that goes by that Sebastian is not subjected to some form of physical abuse. And I describe just 4 occasions upon which Sebastian was abused. On the 30th of July, CCTV shows Sebastian performing squats and push-ups. This exercise punishment regime is interrupted by you, Latoszewski, striking him on the back and the side of the head. You knee him and punch him in the chest. You both then delayed calling an ambulance. By no later than 8:40, it must have been obvious to you both that Sebastian was dead or dying. You, Latoszewski, appear to appreciate the seriousness of the situation and give CPR compressions and breaths. You, Kalinowska, do absolutely nothing other than wander downstairs, making sure that the curtain is lowered on the window in the back door, clean up the table, and you take a drink from a mug. At 9:26, the CCTV is disconnected and the cameras are ripped from the walls. You try and hide the hard drive in the drawer in the living room. You, Latoszewski, telephone your work, explaining that you can't come in today as you have big problems. No ambulance is called until 10:55. When arrested by the police, you both lied. In this trial, Latoszewski, your defence was that your punishment of Sebastian, which you couldn't deny, was reasonable. Kalinowska, you tell the jury that you were coerced into going along with Latoszewski's abuse of Sebastian because you were frightened and that you too were the victim of his violence. Anyone who has watched even part of the CCTV footage of what took place in that house last summer could only be utterly horrified by what they saw, and quite bewildered that anyone would behave in this way towards a teenage boy, let alone one who should be a much-loved child or stepchild. It begs the question of why anyone would behave in this way. This is a question that I have considered myself. It's quite clear to me, Latoszewski, that by your physical abuse of Sebastian, you sought to demonstrate your control and your dominance over him. You made him call you Mr. Andrzej. You installed CCTV so that in your paranoia you could make sure that Sebastian was performing his punishment exercises when you were not there. You were a bully. Minor perceived misdemeanours or teenage acts of defiance were dealt with by extreme punishment. Like all bullies, doubtless unable to obtain respect in any other way, you sought to intimidate and frighten Sebastian, who was weaker than you. And in Sebastian you found an easy prey. You have no self-control. The CCTV footage shows you often flying into a rage, pacing the room with a grimace on your face as you scream at Sebastian. There are times when viewing the footage that it seemed to me that you had lost awareness that you were actually hitting a human being and not your punch bag. Between punches you would pause to admire your physique and the contour of your muscles in the full-length mirror in the living room. As for you, Kalinowska, the explanation is simple. You just did not care about Sebastian. You were only interested in yourself. The letter which you wrote to Latoszewski whilst on remand tells me all that I need to know about your relationship towards your son. In that letter, which is lengthy, you write about yourself. You write about your relationship with Latoszewski and your continued love for him, telling him that you would happily marry him, even wearing a prison uniform. Your only real worry was what had happened to your cat after your arrest and where your cat had been taken. In this very long letter, there is not one word about your son Sebastian, about his death and the loss of that life. I've had the benefit of reading the statement from Sebastian's father. By contrast, he speaks movingly of his sense of loss and his anger, understandable anger, at Sebastian's murder. It's clear to me that Sebastian's wider family in Poland will never forget him and that his death is truly mourned. It is against this background that I now turn to consider the appropriate starting point for the sentence which I must impose. As I have said, the first question is whether the correct starting point is a whole life order or a minimum term of 30 years imprisonment before adjustment for any aggravating or mitigating factors. For the purposes of this case, paragraph 2 of Schedule 21 of the Sentencing Act 2020 provides that the appropriate starting point is a whole life order if the court considers the seriousness of the murder to be exceptionally high. Schedule 21, paragraph 2, subparagraph 2 of the Sentencing Act 2020 provides a non-exhaustive list of cases or examples of cases which will normally fall within the category justifying a whole life term. The list includes the murder of a child, involving the abduction of the child, or sexual or sadistic motivation. The appropriate starting point is a term of 30 years if the seriousness of the offence is particularly high. Paragraph 3, subparagraph 2 provides that cases which will normally fall within this category include a murder involving sadistic conduct. A recent decision of the Court of Appeal provides me with assistance on the approach that I should take to sentencing in this case. The Court emphasised that all cases will, of course, be fact-specific, but it restated that even where a mandatory life sentence is required, a whole life order is very rarely made. Such a sentence is reserved for the few exceptionally serious offences in which, after reflecting on all the features of aggravation and mitigation, the judge is satisfied that the element of just punishment and retribution requires the imposition of a whole life order. The Court of Appeal continued by stating this, that cases of murder involve taking a human life where the offender intended to kill or cause really serious harm. All murders are necessarily extremely serious crimes, and for that reason they attract the mandatory life sentence. The requirement that the seriousness of the offence must be exceptionally high before a whole life order is made therefore arises in that context. Often where such an order is called for, the case will not be on the borderline, and the facts of the case considered as a whole will leave the judge in no doubt that the offender must be kept in prison for the rest of his or her own life. Putting it starkly, the case must be exceptionally serious, even in the context of murder, before a whole life order is made. It's with this assistance and guidance in mind, therefore, that I've therefore considered whether the murder of Sebastian Kalinowski was of such exceptional seriousness that the starting point for sentence is a whole life order. In my judgment, none of the factors which might normally, in the words of Schedule 21, lead to the imposition of a whole life term are present. I do not find that the murder of Sebastian was motivated by sadism. Putting it another way, I don't find that either of you acted as you did towards Sebastian because you took pleasure in the pain or trauma which was inflicted. Clearly, both of you must have been aware of the pain that you were inflicting, but the true motivation, certainly so far as you, Latoszewski, is concerned, is, I find, rather more complicated. As I've already said, I find that your abuse was motivated by the need to dominate, the need to control Sebastian to the point almost of oppression. In your case, Kalinowska, you just didn't care what happened to Sebastian one way or another. You seemed oblivious to the pain that you were inflicting. Standing back and taking into account all of those factors which I must have in mind, I am not sure that this offence is one of such exceptional seriousness as to require me to take that starting point of a whole life term. I therefore take 30 years as my starting point for the minimum term which you must serve, both of you, before consideration is given to your release by the parole board. I emphasise, however, that the 30 years is simply the starting point. I must take into account aggravating factors, and I must take into account mitigating factors. And I recognise that the aggravating factors might, in theory, lead to the imposition of a whole life term. Alternatively, even if I do not impose a whole life order, I recognise that the effect of my sentence may be the equivalent, given your ages now. In this case, there are a number of powerful aggravating factors. 1. Sebastian's vulnerability. Sebastian was a young teenage boy who spoke little, if any, English. He had neither friends nor allies in this country. Sebastian was wholly dependent upon you both for his well-being. He attended school where he encountered teachers who were committed and who were interested in him. But these events took place during the time of COVID, and there was for that reason little continuity of attendance. 2. The abuse of the relationship of trust, which should have existed between mother and child and stepfather and child. 3. The length of the abuse, starting at the very latest in January 2021 and continuing until his death. 4. The extent of the abuse, involving injuries to the torso, ribs, heart, lungs, to serious muscle injuries to the thigh and to the buttocks. 5. The extreme pain which you caused Sebastian, and his very painful death. 6. Your failure to seek hospital or medical assistance in the few days before his death, when it would or should, it must have been apparent to you that Sebastian was seriously ill from infection. And finally, your delay in calling the emergency services after Sebastian's collapse on the 13th of August. Latoszewski, you are 38 years old. Kalinowska, you are 36 years old. Neither of you has in reality any mitigation. It's submitted on your behalf that neither of you had the intention to kill, and I accept that. I accept that had you wished to kill him, it would have been an easy task for you to accomplish. But I consider this to be of marginal relevance, given the nature of the assaults which you inflicted on Sebastian, any one of which could have resulted in fatal injury. Kalinowska, I also bear in mind that you were not the principal perpetrator of the physical abuse, but I see you as a full and willing participant in all that took place over the course of last summer. You may not have hit Sebastian as often as Latoszewski did, or as hard, but by your acts and words you encouraged him in what he did, and I make no token adjustment to reflect the fact that you were not the principal perpetrator of this abuse. For the offence of cruelty to a child, the maximum sentence which I can impose is one of 10 years' imprisonment. The sentence which I impose in respect of this offence will be served concurrently. I am told that you have both served 444 days on remand, and that will be taken into account in calculating the term of imprisonment which you will each serve. If that figure is inaccurate, then it can be dealt with administratively. The victim surcharge will apply. Latoszewski and Kalinowska, please stand up. Latoszewski, for the murder of Sebastian Kalinowski, the sentence of the court is imprisonment for life. I set the minimum term at 39 years. For the offence of cruelty to a child, the sentence is one of 9 years. Kalinowska, for the murder of your son, Sebastian Kalinowski, the sentence of the court is imprisonment for life. I set the minimum term at 39 years. For the offence of cruelty to a child, the sentence is one of 9 years. Thank you, dock officers. Please take the defendants.